Picture this. The most powerful navy in the world, with 11 massive aircraft carriers patrolling the oceans, suddenly faces a crisis not from an enemy, but from its own cutting-edge technology. Sailors are injured, planes sit idle, and a $2 billion system that was supposed to revolutionize naval warfare becomes the subject of heated congressional hearings. This is the story of EMALS, the Electromagnetic Aircraft Launch System, a technological marvel that promised to change everything, but instead became one of the most controversial weapons systems in modern American military history. Between 2015 and 2023, this system would test the limits of engineering ambition, challenge the relationship between the military and defense contractors, spark debates at the highest levels of government, and even draw criticism from a sitting president. What went wrong? How did a system designed to be more reliable than its predecessor end up causing more problems? And perhaps most importantly, what does this tell us about the future of military innovation in an era where technology moves faster than ever before? Stay with me for the next hour as we dive deep into one of the most fascinating and frustrating chapters in modern naval engineering. To understand the EMALS story, we need to go back to where it all began. For nearly 70 years, the United States Navy launched aircraft from carriers using a system that, while effective, was essentially a massive steam-powered catapult. The steam catapult was invented during World War II and had been refined over decades. It worked by using high-pressure steam to drive pistons that would accelerate aircraft from 0 to over 170 miles per hour in just 2 seconds. These systems were reliable, proven, and well understood by generations of sailors and engineers. But they had limitations. Steam catapults were heavy, required constant maintenance, used fresh water that had to be desalinated from seawater, and couldn't precisely control the acceleration forces applied to aircraft. Different aircraft required different launch speeds, and the steam system could only roughly adjust its power output. This meant stress on airframes and limitations on which aircraft could be safely launched. By the late 1990s, the Navy was planning its next generation of aircraft carriers, the Gerald R. Ford class. These would be the most advanced warships ever built, incorporating technologies that would make them more efficient, more capable, and more cost-effective to operate over their 50-year service lives. The Navy saw this as an opportunity to replace the aging steam catapult technology with something revolutionary. Enter electromagnetic launch technology. The concept was elegant. Instead of using steam pressure, why not use electromagnetic forces? Linear induction motors, similar to those being developed for high-speed trains, could accelerate a shuttle along a track, pulling the aircraft with it. The advantages seemed obvious. Electromagnetic systems could be precisely controlled by computers, adjusting acceleration perfectly for each type of aircraft. They would be more reliable with fewer moving parts. They wouldn't require steam, freeing up that energy for other ship systems. They would be lighter and take up less space. And they would be more efficient, requiring less maintenance and fewer crew members to operate. The Navy contracted with General Atomics, a company known for its work in nuclear physics and defense technology, to develop EMALS. This wasn't General Atomics' first foray into electromagnetic launch systems. They had been working on the concept since the 1980s, and by the early 2000s, they had built test facilities and demonstrated the basic principles. The contract to develop EMALS for the Ford-class carriers was signed, and work began in earnest. The engineering challenges were immense. The system needed to store vast amounts of electrical energy and release it in precisely controlled bursts. It had to work reliably in the harsh marine environment, with salt air, humidity, and constant motion. It had to be safe for both the aircraft and the personnel operating it. And it had to do all of this while being more reliable than a system that had been proven over 7 decades of use. The heart of EMALS is a series of components working in perfect harmony. First, there are the energy storage groups. These use rotating disc alternators, essentially massive flywheels that spin constantly, storing kinetic energy. When a launch is needed, this energy is converted to electricity. Then there's the power conditioning system, which takes that electrical energy and converts it into the precise form needed for the launch. Finally, there's the linear induction motor itself, stretching over 300 feet along the flight deck. This motor creates a moving magnetic field that pulls the launch shuttle and the attached aircraft down the deck. The entire process, from the decision to launch to the aircraft leaving the deck, takes just seconds, but it requires perfect coordination of systems managing millions of watts of power. Development continued through the 2000s. Test facilities on land put the system through its paces. Thousands of test launches were conducted using weighted sleds simulating aircraft. The data looked promising. The system could launch aircraft across a wide range of weights, from light drones to heavy cargo planes, all with smooth, controlled acceleration. In 2009, EMALS successfully launched its first actual aircraft, an F-18 fighter jet, at Naval Air Engineering Station Lakehurst in New Jersey. The test was celebrated as a major milestone. The Navy was confident. General Atomics was confident. The technology worked in testing. Now it was time to put it on a ship. The USS Gerald R. Ford, CVN-78, was laid down in November 2009. This carrier would be the first of its class and the first to use EMALS instead of steam catapults. The ship was massive, over 1,100 feet long, displacing 100,000 tons, and costing nearly $13 billion. It represented the future of American naval power. EMALS was installed along with other new technologies, including the advanced arresting gear system for recovering aircraft, new radar systems, and a redesigned island structure. The Ford was commissioned in July 2017, and that's when the real problems began. Initial testing revealed issues immediately. The system wasn't reaching the reliability targets the Navy had set. In military aviation, reliability isn't just a nice-to-have feature. It's absolutely critical. Aircraft carriers are designed to launch and recover aircraft around the clock during combat operations. A single carrier might need to launch dozens of aircraft in a short period during strike operations. If the launch system fails, aircraft sit on the deck, missions are delayed or canceled, and the entire tactical picture can be compromised. The Navy had set a requirement that EMALS should be able to perform 4,166 cycles, that's launches, between operational mission failures. This was actually a lower standard than the steam catapults, which achieved about 5,000 cycles between failures. But EMALS wasn't even close to meeting its own lower target. Early data showed the system was failing far more frequently. The types of failures varied. Sometimes it was the energy storage system. Those massive rotating disks that stored power would experience problems. Sometimes it was the power electronics. The systems that converted and controlled the electrical energy were complex and sensitive. Sometimes it was software issues. The computer systems controlling the launches would glitch. And sometimes it was mechanical problems with the linear motor itself, or the shuttle that connected to the aircraft. Each failure meant delays, troubleshooting, and often, bringing in specialized technicians to diagnose and fix problems. Sailors who had trained on steam catapults for their entire careers now had to learn an entirely new system, and when things went wrong, they couldn't always fix them with the traditional hands-on maintenance approaches they knew. But reliability wasn't the only problem. There were safety concerns too. In May 2017, just months before the Ford was commissioned, there was an incident during testing. A weighted sled being launched broke free from the shuttle. This was exactly the kind of catastrophic failure that couldn't happen with a real aircraft attached. If an aircraft separated unexpectedly during launch, it could crash on the deck or into the water, potentially killing the pilot and causing millions of dollars in damage. The Navy and General Atomics investigated and implemented fixes, but the incident raised serious questions about whether the system was ready for operational use. Then there were the less dramatic but equally troubling issues with the physical stress on personnel and equipment. While EMALS could theoretically provide smoother acceleration than steam catapults, in practice, there were reports of uncomfortable or even dangerous G-forces during certain launches. Pilots reported unexpected jolts. Maintenance crews reported problems with aircraft structural stress. The system that was supposed to be gentler on airframes was, in some cases, being harder on them. This wasn't just about comfort. Excessive G-forces could cause injuries to pilots, and unexpected stress on aircraft could lead to structural damage or reduce service life. By 2018, the problems with EMALS were becoming public. The Government Accountability Office, the investigative arm of Congress, began looking into the Ford's new technologies. Their reports were damning. EMALS was significantly behind on reliability targets. The advanced arresting gear system was having similar problems. The cost of fixing these issues was climbing, and the schedule for getting the Ford fully operational was slipping. What was supposed to be a smooth transition to new technology was turning into a crisis. Congress started asking hard questions during hearings. Admirals had to testify about the problems. Defense contractors were called to explain what had gone wrong and how they planned to fix it. And then President Trump weighed in. In May 2017, during an interview, he criticized EMALS directly. He said the electromagnetic system was too complicated and too expensive. He argued that the Navy should go back to steam catapults, calling them more reliable and easier to maintain. He famously said that steam was simpler and worked better, questioning why the Navy needed digital systems when analog ones had worked fine for decades. This was extraordinary. It's rare for a president to publicly criticize a specific military technology and development. The comments sparked a national debate about military innovation, the cost of new weapons systems, and whether newer always meant better. The Navy found itself in a difficult position. They had invested billions in EMALS. The Ford was already built and commissioned with the system installed. Going back to steam wasn't really an option, not just because of sunk costs, but because the Ford and future carriers in the class weren't designed with the infrastructure for steam catapults. They didn't have the boilers and steam systems that earlier carriers had. The entire ship design was built around electric power generation and distribution. Ripping out EMALS and installing steam catapults would have been prohibitively expensive and would have required redesigning major portions of the ship. The Navy had to make EMALS work. There was no alternative, so they doubled down on fixing the problems. General Atomics brought in additional engineers. The Navy assigned more resources to troubleshooting and testing. They implemented design changes to address the reliability issues. Software was rewritten to smooth out the launch profiles and reduce stress on aircraft. Hardware components that were failing frequently were redesigned or replaced with more robust versions. The energy storage systems were modified. The power electronics were upgraded. Every system was scrutinized and improved. This process took time and money. Each fix had to be tested thoroughly to make sure it didn't create new problems. And because the Ford was still going through its own testing and certification process, coordinating all these fixes with the ship's overall schedule was a logistical nightmare. Meanwhile, the Navy was facing another challenge. The second Ford-class carrier, the USS John F. Kennedy, was already under construction. It too would use EMALS. The third carrier, the USS Enterprise, was being planned. The Navy couldn't afford to have the same problems repeat with each new ship. They needed to make sure that the lessons learned from the Ford were applied to the Kennedy and Enterprise. This meant that fixes weren't just being implemented on the Ford. They were being incorporated into the design and construction of the newer ships. This added complexity and cost, but it was necessary to avoid compounding the problems. The reliability issues with EMALS also raised broader questions about how the Navy developed and tested new technologies. Traditionally, new systems go through extensive testing on land before being installed on ships. But with something as integrated as EMALS, which relies on the ship's electrical systems and is built into the structure of the carrier, full realistic testing before installation is nearly impossible. The Navy had tested EMALS on land, but the marine environment, the operational tempo, and the integration with other ship systems created conditions that couldn't be fully replicated at a test facility. This meant that some problems only showed up once the system was on the Ford and being used in realistic conditions. Critics argued that the Navy had rushed the technology to deployment before it was ready. Defenders argued that this was the only way to truly test such a complex, integrated system. By 2019, there were signs of progress. The reliability numbers were improving, slowly but steadily. EMALS on the Ford was launching aircraft more consistently. Failures were becoming less frequent. The worst safety issues had been addressed. But the system still wasn't meeting its targets. The Navy revised some of those targets, arguing that the original requirements had been overly optimistic. This was controversial. Some saw it as a practical acknowledgement that perfect reliability was impossible with such a complex system. Others saw it as moving the goalposts to hide the fact that EMALS wasn't performing as promised. The debate continues to this day. One of the most significant challenges was the learning curve for the sailors operating and maintaining EMALS. Steam catapults were mechanical systems that sailors could see and feel and understand intuitively. When something broke, experienced crews could often diagnose and fix problems on the spot using tools and parts they carried with them. EMALS was different. It was an electrical and software-based system. Diagnosing problems often required specialized test equipment and an understanding of complex electronics. Fixes might require software patches or replacing circuit boards rather than mechanical repairs. The Navy had to completely rethink how it trained sailors for this role. New schools were established. Training programs were developed, but it took time for that institutional knowledge to build up. In the early years, the Ford often had to rely on civilian contractors from General Atomics to fix problems because the sailors simply didn't have the expertise yet. There was also the issue of spare parts and logistics. With steam catapults, the supply chain was well established. The Navy knew what parts would fail and how often, and they stocked supplies accordingly. With EMALS being new, there wasn't that historical data. Some parts that were expected to be reliable failed frequently. Other parts that had been stocked heavily were rarely needed. The Navy and General Atomics had to adjust the supply chain on the fly, sometimes waiting for parts to be manufactured when unexpected failures occurred. This contributed to delays in getting the system back online after failures. The cost overruns associated with EMALS became a significant political issue. The original development contract had been for hundreds of millions of dollars. But as problems emerged and fixes were implemented, costs escalated. By some estimates, the Navy and General Atomics spent over $1 billion beyond the original projections dealing with EMALS issues on the Ford and preparing for the Kennedy and Enterprise. Taxpayer watchdog groups questioned whether this was money well spent. Congressional committees held hearings examining the costs. There were calls for more oversight, for penalties against contractors who failed to deliver systems that met specifications, and for reforms in how the military developed new technologies. Through 2020 and 2021, testing continued. The Ford went through various phases of sea trials and operational testing. EMALS launched thousands of aircraft. F-18 Super Hornets, E-2 Hawkeye early warning aircraft, and other types were put through their paces. Data was collected on every launch. Engineers analyzed the performance. Incremental improvements were made. The system was getting better, but it still wasn't where it needed to be for full operational capability. The Navy set deadlines for achieving reliability targets, and then extended those deadlines when the targets weren't met. This pattern repeated several times, frustrating both supporters and critics of the system. One breakthrough came from better understanding the maintenance requirements. Early on, the Navy had estimated that EMALS would require significantly less maintenance than steam catapults. In practice, it required different maintenance. While some tasks were eliminated, new ones were added. The total maintenance burden wasn't dramatically lower, it was just different. Once the Navy adjusted maintenance schedules and procedures to match what EMALS actually needed rather than what they'd hoped it would need, reliability improved. This seems obvious in hindsight, but it took years of operational experience to figure out. By 2022, the conversation around EMALS was starting to shift. The system still had problems, but it was functional. The Ford successfully completed multiple deployments, launching aircraft in realistic operational scenarios. EMALS worked well enough for the ship to perform its mission. Was it as reliable as steam catapults? Not yet. Was it reliable enough to be operationally useful? Yes, increasingly so. The Navy's position evolved from defending EMALS as perfect to acknowledging its issues while arguing that they were manageable and improving. This more realistic assessment actually helped restore some confidence in the program. The Kennedy's construction benefited enormously from the lessons learned on the Ford. The EMALS installation on the Kennedy incorporated all the fixes and improvements that had been developed. Early testing on the Kennedy showed better reliability than the Ford had achieved at a similar stage. This suggested that once the problems were understood and addressed, EMALS could indeed be more reliable. The question was whether it would ever achieve the dramatic improvements over steam catapults that had been promised, or whether it would end up being roughly equivalent in reliability, but with different advantages and disadvantages. One advantage that became clear over time was the flexibility EMALS offered. It could launch lighter aircraft and drones that would have been difficult or impossible to launch with steam catapults. As the Navy looked toward a future with more unmanned systems, this capability became increasingly valuable. EMALS could also launch heavier aircraft more safely by providing smoother acceleration. For large cargo aircraft or heavily loaded strike fighters, this was a real benefit. The precision control that had caused so many early problems actually turned into a selling point once the software and controls were properly developed. In 2023, the Navy reported that EMALS on the Ford had achieved significant reliability milestones. While exact numbers remained classified, Officials indicated that the system was approaching acceptable operational reliability. The Kennedy was preparing for its own sea trials with EMALS. The Enterprise's design incorporated even further refinements. The crisis phase seemed to be over, replaced by a long-term effort to optimize and improve the system. But the scars remained. The EMALS experience had made the Navy more cautious about introducing revolutionary new technologies. Future programs were subjected to more scrutiny and more extensive testing before deployment. The EMALS story also influenced broader debates about military acquisition. Should the military pursue revolutionary technologies that promise dramatic improvements but carry high risks, or should they focus on evolutionary improvements to proven systems? There's no easy answer. Steam catapults themselves were revolutionary when first introduced. Every major advancement in military technology involved risk and periods of teething problems. But in an era of tight budgets and intense congressional oversight, the tolerance for expensive failures is lower than ever. The challenge is finding the right balance between innovation and reliability, between pushing the boundaries of what's possible and ensuring that systems work when needed. Looking at the technical details, what made EMALS so difficult to get right? Part of it was the power requirements. Launching a 40,000-pound aircraft to 170 miles per hour in 2 seconds requires an enormous amount of energy delivered very quickly. The energy storage and delivery systems had to handle repeated cycles of charging and discharging at extreme power levels. Materials science played a role. The components had to withstand not just the electrical stresses, but also the physical environment of a ship at sea, with temperature variations, humidity, salt exposure, and vibration. Software complexity was another factor. Modern systems like EMALS rely on sophisticated software to control every aspect of operation. Bugs in that software could cause failures or unpredictable behavior. And integration challenges emerged from making EMALS work seamlessly with the ship's electrical grid, the flight deck control systems, and the aircraft themselves. Comparing EMALS to steam catapults reveals interesting trade-offs. Steam catapults are heavy, complex mechanical systems with thousands of parts, many of which move under enormous stress. They require extensive maintenance, with major overhauls every few years. They consume fresh water that must be produced by the ship's desalination systems. They take up significant space below decks for the steam accumulators and machinery. But they're well understood, repair procedures are established, and sailors know how to keep them running. EMALS, on the other hand, is lighter and more compact. It doesn't require steam, freeing up resources. It has fewer moving parts in theory, requiring less maintenance. But it requires high-power electrical systems, sensitive electronics, and specialized expertise to maintain. Neither system is perfect. Each has strengths and weaknesses. The human factor in the EMALS story can't be overlooked. Engineers at General Atomics worked under enormous pressure to fix the problems. Navy sailors learned a new technology while dealing with the frustration of frequent failures. Pilots trusted their lives to a system that was still being debugged. Admirals defended decisions that were being questioned at the highest levels of government. The stress on all these people was significant. Some engineers burned out. Some sailors requested transfers. Some pilots expressed doubts about the system's safety. Managing the human side of a technological crisis is just as challenging as solving the technical problems. There were also geopolitical implications. China was watching the EMALS development closely. They were building their own aircraft carriers and developing their own electromagnetic launch systems. If EMALS had failed completely, it might have discouraged China from pursuing the technology. But as EMALS gradually improved, it validated the concept, encouraging Chinese investment in similar systems. Russia and other nations also took note. The development of EMALS, despite its problems, demonstrated that electromagnetic launch was feasible for carrier aviation. This pushed other nations to pursue the technology, potentially reducing America's technological edge in this area. The media coverage of EMALS evolved over time. Early stories were mostly positive, highlighting the revolutionary nature of the technology. As problems emerged, coverage became more critical. Headlines focused on failures, cost overruns, and delays. Presidential criticism intensified the media attention. By the later years, coverage became more balanced, acknowledging both the problems and the progress. But the initial negative publicity had lasting effects on public perception of the program. Many people who followed the story casually came away with the impression that EMALS was a failure, even as it gradually became more successful. Let's talk about what success actually means for a system like EMALS. Is it successful if it works better than steam catapults? Is it successful if it works as well as steam catapults, but with some additional benefits? Is it successful if it simply works well enough to be operationally viable? These questions don't have obvious answers. The Navy's original vision was that EMALS would be dramatically more reliable, significantly cheaper to maintain, and would enable new capabilities. That vision hasn't been fully realized. But EMALS does work. It is enabling some new capabilities, and it's improving over time. Whether that constitutes success depends on your perspective and expectations. The lessons from EMALS extend beyond just this one system. They speak to how complex technologies are developed, tested, and deployed. They highlight the challenges of replacing proven systems with new ones. They demonstrate the importance of realistic testing and the difficulty of predicting how systems will perform in operational environments. They show the need for flexibility and adaptability when problems emerge. And they underscore the importance of managing expectations and communicating clearly about both capabilities and limitations. These lessons are relevant not just for military systems, but for any large-scale technological project. As we look forward, EMALS will likely continue to improve. The Ford-class carriers will serve for 50 years. Over that time, EMALS will undergo continuous upgrades and refinements. The institutional knowledge will grow. New generations of sailors will be trained on the system from the beginning, rather than having to transition from steam catapults. Software will be optimized. Components will be improved. The system will mature. In 30 years, EMALS might be regarded as a successful technology that went through normal teething problems. Or it might be seen as a cautionary tale of technological ambition exceeding capability. The final verdict isn't in yet. One fascinating aspect of the EMALS story is how it intersects with broader trends in military technology. Modern weapons systems are increasingly complex, increasingly software-dependent, and increasingly expensive. The development cycles are long, often spanning decades from initial concept to full operational capability. This creates challenges for militaries trying to maintain technological superiority in a rapidly changing world. By the time a system like EMALS is fully debugged and operational, potential adversaries have had years to develop countermeasures or alternative approaches. The traditional model of military acquisition, with lengthy development and testing phases, may not be well suited to the pace of modern technological change. There's also the question of whether the Navy learned the right lessons from EMALS. In the aftermath of the problems, some reforms were implemented. More emphasis was placed on realistic testing. More attention was paid to reliability requirements. But some critics argue that the fundamental approach hasn't changed enough. They point to other programs with similar patterns of promising revolutionary capabilities, encountering problems during development, and ending up behind schedule and over budget. Whether EMALS leads to genuine reform in how the military develops new technologies, or becomes just another example in a long series of troubled programs remains to be seen. The contractors involved, particularly General Atomics, face their own challenges. Defense contracting is a complex business. Companies must balance the technical challenges of developing cutting-edge systems with the financial realities of fixed-price or cost-plus contracts. When problems emerge, contractors can face financial losses, damage to reputation, and difficulty winning future contracts. But they also have strong incentives to make systems work, as their future business depends on successful programs. General Atomics invested heavily in fixing EMALS, not just because they were contractually obligated, but because their credibility in the defense market depended on it. The relationship between the military and defense contractors is often adversarial, with each side blaming the other when problems arise. But it can also be collaborative, with both sides working together to solve difficult technical challenges. The international dimension of naval aviation technology is worth considering. The United States has 11 aircraft carriers, more than all other nations combined. This gives America unique capabilities for power projection, but it also means the U.S. has unique challenges in operating and maintaining these massive ships. Technologies like EMALS are developed specifically for American carriers, with relatively little opportunity to learn from other nations' experiences or to amortize development costs across international sales. This contrasts with fighter aircraft or other systems that are developed with export markets in mind. The niche nature of carrier aviation technology means the US bears the full burden of development costs and risks. As we near the end of our exploration of EMALS, it's worth reflecting on what this story tells us about innovation. Innovation is risky. It involves venturing into the unknown, trying things that haven't been done before, and accepting the possibility of failure. The alternative to innovation is stagnation, continuing to use increasingly outdated technologies while potential adversaries develop newer and better systems. But innovation must be managed carefully. The risks must be understood and mitigated. Expectations must be realistic. And there must be contingency plans for when things don't work as hoped. The EMALS story shows both the promise and the peril of military innovation. In conclusion, the Electromagnetic Aircraft Launch System represents one of the most significant technological transitions in naval aviation history. From 2015 through 2023, EMALS went from a promising technology to a troubled system to a gradually maturing capability. The journey was marked by technical challenges, safety concerns, cost overruns, political controversy, and ultimately incremental progress. The system that was supposed to revolutionize carrier aviation ended up causing headaches for everyone involved. But it also pushed the boundaries of what was possible, demonstrated that electromagnetic launch was viable for carrier operations, and paved the way for future innovations. Whether history judges EMALS as a success or a failure may depend on how the system performs over the coming decades. What's certain is that the lessons learned from EMALS will influence military technology development for years to come. The story of EMALS is the story of ambition meeting reality, of technological optimism confronting practical challenges, and of the difficulty of replacing proven systems with new ones. It's a reminder that in the world of military technology, there are no easy answers, no risk-free choices, and no shortcuts to success. The future of warfare will be shaped by technologies we're developing today, and the EMALS experience teaches us to approach that future with both boldness and humility.